Many of you probably know by now that Sony's been making headlines over the past week because of their recent announcement that they'd be shutting down the stores of PlayStation 3, PlayStation Portable, and PlayStation Vita. This was initially reported by news outlet The Gamer back in March 22nd, 2021 via a report from sources, and it was only a couple days later that Sony confirmed that the closure of these stores is in fact happening, detailing that the PlayStation 3 store will close on July 2nd alongside the PlayStation Portable store, and then the PS Vita store will close on August 27th. And there's been plenty of discussions about game preservation and how Sony's been failing to, well, preserve their own legacy, their own history, and with the inability to emulate these games on PS5 with Sony not implementing a backwards compatibility or forwards compatibility feature, there are plenty of games that are going to be lost forever, particularly exclusives to these specific platforms. But what isn't really being talked about all that much until now is how this has affected developers, because believe it or not, there are still developers making games for PlayStation Vita. The Vita might not have been home to the biggest titles, especially after Sony stopped supporting the console, but a lot of indie games have come out on Vita, and even today a decent amount of indie games are making their way to Vita. But with the closure of the PlayStation Store on Vita on August 27th, there will be no way to distribute those games because these indie titles tend to get digital releases only due to the fact that they don't have funds to enact a physical release. And that's why we're seeing tweets like this. So right here, for example, we have Lilymo Games who tweeted, "With today's news of the Vita store closure, we sadly have had to cancel the Vita version of our next game. The store will be closed before our next game is ready, so it seems Abroxia 2 will be our final Vita release." Somebody responded with, "That's disappointing. It seems like a lot of developers are shocked at the news, as well as if PlayStation didn't even bother getting in touch with anyone and just doing their own thing." Lilymo Games responded by noting that most developers were in fact not warned about this. "You're finding out at the same time we are. I was working on Vita-specific tasks this morning before the announcement finally happened." Here's another developer, Thomas Altenberger, who tweeted, "This is official. Scourgebringer on PS Vita will be a limited release and will only be playable for 128 days before vanishing, no developer pun intended in the number, from April 22nd to August 27th. 128 days to get the last PS Vita game to release digitally." So because there was no advance warning, some developers have had to cancel their PS Vita ports, and others are rushing to get it out. Now, news outlet The Gamer, who initially reported on these closures before Sony's announcement, The Gamer essentially was the most advanced notice developers got. They followed up with an article today detailing some conversations they've had with various developers who were affected by Sony's lack of communication about their store closure. And so I'd like to go through this article and share the quotes and details in question, and also relay my own opinions on the matter. Among the developers affected was German studio Behind the Stone, who released Sir Eats a Lot, a 2D platformer for PS Vita. Here's a quote that was relayed to The Gamer. "Change is something that needs to happen at a publisher level. Otherwise, players looking to replay these games will have to acquire them from questionable sources instead of the console they're intended for." Which is another way of saying, hey, Sony, if you want to mitigate piracy, then offer a better way of doing things, a better convenience of accessing games than piracy. People do want to pay for games and support developers, but if you're going to make that a pain in the ass, then guess what? The piracy scene is only going to thrive further. People are going to resort more to emulation and jailbreaking, you name it. The quote continues, "By removing the legitimate option, publishers aren't leaving players with much choice." Exactly. It's especially frustrating given how much effort Microsoft is putting into preserving its library and seeing great success with it. A big part of why Game Pass is so appealing is because there are plenty of classic titles in there as well, but beyond that, yeah, they are indeed going out of their way to try to preserve as many Xbox 360 and original Xbox titles as they can, and even enhancing them with system-wide features, whether it's FPS boost or just utilizing the more advanced hardware, faster loading times, whatever it is, there are tangible enhancements alongside the preservation of those titles. This is certainly one area where Xbox has completely excelled above its other competitors. Finally, this developer said, for me personally, it's also somewhat a sentimental moment. The Vita was home to the first games I ever worked on, and it's always nice hearing from people who still play those games or recently picked them up and are enjoying them for the first time. It's sad knowing that those games are a lot less likely to be discovered and enjoyed. I'll certainly be making sure I download them before they're lost to the either. PlayStation Vita certainly didn't rock the world with its sales numbers, but the people who did buy it really do love it. It's a great piece of hardware to play great games on, but it was Sony's lack of support that ultimately killed the console and killed interest surrounding it. But for the people who did buy it, they do still engage with it from time to time, and there's still enough of a market there that indie developers are still releasing games on Vita. No one supported PlayStation Vita more than indie devs, let's put it that way. And that made Vita an attractive proposition for players who are fans of indie titles. Now, fortunately for German studio Behind the Stone, they did predict that Sony would be ending support for the PlayStation Store on Vita relatively soon, and so they did work on a Switch port because, quote, the way Sony treated the device was telling. But if it wasn't for that foresight, that would be 3 years of development time that would have just been thrown away, and this developer would have had no time to prepare for this because developers found out about the store's closure the same way most people did, through the Gamer's report and then later through Sony's official announcement. Now, other developers weren't fortunate enough to port their PS Vita exclusive titles to other platforms before the store's closure, and so this is the experience that developer John Barry, who worked on Licky, The Lucky Lizard Lives Again, said in a statement to The Gamer. There are no current plans to port the game over to other platforms. I'm currently developing a new game, so I'm pretty deep into that at the moment. Maybe at some point in the future, just for the sake of preservation. It's true that I'm not losing income, but I was pretty angry when I found out about the store closing, to be honest. I don't understand the logic. Surely if PlayStation's back-end systems were in good order, there could be a one-time migration upgrade to unify all content from all previous generations into one store. This is just the latest example of Sony's failings when it comes to online infrastructure. Granted, some of that is speculation on my part. Now, the issue right now with a unified PlayStation Store ecosystem is that there is currently no way to play PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3, PlayStation Portable, and PlayStation Vita titles on the more modern consoles like PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5. There is PlayStation Now, but that's limited in terms of how many of the legacy titles are there, and the fact that it relies so heavily on cloud means that it's not the most attractive of propositions. Until Sony implements a way to emulate games of older PlayStation consoles on PS4 and or PS5, there's just no point to a unified store. But going back to this developer, if they were to do a port of this PS Vita title, apparently it would take months, especially because PlayStation's online infrastructure for leaderboards is different on Vita, and so that makes it more complicated to port it over. So yeah, it's a lot of time, resources, and work that Sony has offloaded to the developers who were not warned about the store closures and the fact that their games would be lost into the ether. There are also financial ramifications that come with this for developers. For example, Pablo Checa, who made a shoot-'em-up called Task Force Campus, talked about how the loss of Vita will wipe out between 20 to 40% of projected sales profits. Because again, people are still playing PlayStation Vita. It's not a huge amount of people, but enough that some indie devs deem it worth releasing their titles on the platform. But with the Vita store closing without warning, that's going to wipe out some potential profits that could have come from that platform. And then the studio's next game, El Gancho, was also planned for Vita, but the developer can't make the deadline and will have to cancel. The Gamer also talked about developers who are crunching to beat that deadline to get the game out a decent amount of time before the store closure to at least rack up some initial sales. So Miguel Sternberg of indie studio Spooky Squid Games was working on a PS Vita port of Russian Subway Dogs, but like all the other developers course, he got no warning from Sony about the store closure, and so he said this: "As a big fan of the handheld, PS Vita was always a long-term goal for the game, so all the pixel art was designed to perfectly scale to both PS Vita screen and 1080p. Newer versions of GameMaker also no longer support the Vita, so I've transitioned to the newer GameMaker Studio 2, and that's limited the amount of technical support I have access to." This developer hopes to beat the impending cutoff, and while that is the case for the US, in Europe, it won't be possible to do so because of having to be certified by the Video Game Classification Board, PEGI, and beyond that, there are apparently contracts that were signed that would restrict his ability to release the Vita version earlier than other platforms. There's so many moving pieces to game development, and when you've got a platform that developers are still making games for, you as a company have a responsibility to at the very least communicate your future plans well in advance. Sony obviously did not do that. Miguel continued, "Basically, it's a whole new headache on top of the already complex process of releasing on consoles as a small developer. The port really has been a labor of love. We're way past the point where it makes a ton of financial sense to release on Vita, but it's one of my all-time favorite consoles, and I wanted to release a game on it before everything shut down. Most of the price of deciding to do a Vita port has already been paid. This is my first time going through this process of coding for consoles. My game dev background is art, not code, so there's no guarantee I'll hit the deadline. It's a lot of stress." Vita ports indeed don't make the most financial sense, which really goes to show that Vita games that still are coming out today, they are indeed labors of love. These ports are passion projects for that community, and it sucks that Sony's closing the doors on that when the Vita still has a little bit of life left in it, which is ironic because Vita means life, I believe, in Latin. And to further highlight that this is a labor of love, the developer of Astro, Aqua, Kitty, an arcade shooter, had this to say: "We always felt PS Vita development was going to be a risk, but we wanted to keep supporting PS Vita anyway, as we really liked the console, so we kept maintaining the Vita version as we developed the game across multiple platforms." And porting games over to Vita is not easy because Vita does have memory constraints, so this was the version that this developer spent the most time with to get right, only to learn that, all that work was for naught. The closure of the store is disappointing for the console as a whole. It's unfortunate for us too, as it limits the availability of our game after it is released mid-April. But we're happy at least to be releasing our biggest and best PS Vita title yet, and we're hoping it will find a strong audience on Vita before the store closes. The thing about indie developers is that they don't have the biggest marketing budget. They're completely unknown entities, and so even if they're releasing their ports or their games on a niche console like Vita, there might be an audience there for that game, and that audience might help spread the word, and that might be a great stepping stone towards that indie developer becoming better known. But with Sony's latest decision, Vita will no longer hold that kind of value. As for how poor Sony's communication has been, Lilimo Games, who tweeted this right here, expressed that they reached out to Sony via email and the support ticket system to see if the report from the gamer was accurate, and got no response. Even when Sony was reached out to, was directly asked in the days leading up to the official announcement, no responses were provided to relevant parties like, the developers making games for Vita. And the founder of Lilimo Games, Barry Johnson, expressed how we work on this older, less capable engine and convert our work out of our dedication to the PS Vita. I couldn't even quantify how much work this has cost us on that level, to be honest. Sony has to understand that how they mismanaged this has led to a lot of developers losing a whole lot of time, money, resources, and a decently sizable, albeit niche audience that was more than willing to wait for these games and to buy these games and support these games. Now, here's what makes this all the more egregious. This development studio bought a new PS Vita developer kit through Sony just last month, and were not told then about the closure. And I have little doubt in my mind that Sony knew a month ago that they were going to close down the stores, that they were going to make this announcement. Maybe they were finalizing certain details, but when it comes to things like store closures, that kind of decision doesn't happen in the span of a month. It happens ways in advance. A month ago, Sony Knew still provided and sold a PlayStation Vita development kit to a developer and basically gave them a false sense of security. And if that wasn't egregious enough, Turns out that while the smaller developers, the indie developers weren't warned, bigger name developers who asked to remain anonymous were warned in advance. This should come as no surprise. Sony, first and foremost, is a corporation. Their primary goal is profits, and bigger name developers have more potential to make Sony more money. And so, of course, they're the ones who get priority communication while the indie developers are left to bite the dust because I guess they're not important enough. Other developers had to read between the lines, with Thomas Altenberger of Flying Oak saying that he got some clues from Sony. He said, "We had some very strong hints for quite some time, but we didn't know the exact moment." Now, funny enough, with this developer kind of seeing that in the not-so-distant future, Vita store were closed, they used this as motivation to get a game out on Vita, stating, actually, the whole thing started as kind of a joke. We didn't have the PS Vita planned at all, but when we had those hints of an imminent end of support, we took it as a fun challenge and a way to say thank you to the community that has been surprisingly hopeful against all odds and signs. That is certainly kind of wholesome to hear, but marred ultimately by the way Sony handled all of this. I think store closures without means to play a lot of those games that will be lost on other consoles, the whole game preservation aspect is already horribly handled, but also the cost that it came for developers who are still making games on Vita, who value that community, you know, that makes the optics surrounding all of this that much worse. It cannot possibly be rocket science for Sony to implement some way to play PlayStation 3, PlayStation Portable, and PlayStation Vita titles on PS5. It's a powerful enough console, at the very least, for PSP and PS Vita. PS3 emulation might be more complicated because of how weird that system's architecture was, but overall, I would hope that Sony's working on something. I would hope that they would at least announce something along the lines of, we don't have any details to share right now, but we are looking into ways to bring old games into the new console and preserve those titles and allow people to continue purchasing all of these games that came out on especially PS Vita, which is host to so many indie games and ports and you name it. There has to be a better way to do this, a better way to communicate this, but alas, this is where we're at now. All we can do is keep our fingers crossed that Sony is hearing the backlash surrounding their lack of game preservation loud and clear, because game preservation features backwards compatibility, forwards compatibility, some emulation element, whatever it is, it's going to be good for business, and it's going to be good for customers, and it's going to be good for developers who are going to find a new audience with games that they've released in consoles past. Everyone wins. So Sony, please, take this aspect seriously. Xbox has taken it seriously. It's doing wonders for them. Follow in their footsteps in this regard. Or at least that's one man's take on everything. Let me know in the comments below what you think about how Sony has been handling the closures of PlayStation 3, PlayStation Portable, and PlayStation Vita stores. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.